questions. For those of you that are still coming in, please feel free to get food. You don't have to race around to get a seat, although we have a lot of filled seats already, which is great. My name is Sarah Ripp. I am the Academic Services and Programming Manager for LASI's, and we're super happy to see so many new faces here at the lecture today. This is wonderful. Just a couple of quick announcements. You obviously see we have food and drink, so please help yourself. Also, on the corner here of the table, there is a list of a sort of a sign-in sheet. If you could please sign in for us, we need to turn that into the accounting department to pay for lunch. So that's not a fun thing, but it's important. Also, we have some flyers for some other upcoming events that Kate Deline, our faculty director, is going to talk to you guys about. So thanks for coming.
Yes, I just take 30 seconds of your time. I'm Kate Deline, faculty director of LASI's. And I'm also very happy to see so many faces here, but I'm not surprised because it's going to be a very exciting lecture for all of us. And I just wanted to tell you that we are continuing with the themes that we hear about today. In the next two lectures, next week, the role of community organizing to confront climate change and forced migration in El Salvador. And the following Tuesday, the Yakalteco language of Guadalupe Victoria, a Mayan community with endangered language near Tapachula in Chiapas. Both of these lectures connect to main themes of this year, which are race and indigeneity and migration. We are preparing a conference on migration next spring. So welcome everybody, and Lara Schlechter will introduce our speaker.
Hello everyone, welcome. I'm so thrilled to see so many people in the room today, especially with the thunderstorm outside. Thank you for being here. My name is Laura Hansen-Schlachter. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology here at UW-Madison, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome Aaron Bobrov-Strain here to campus. He's a professor of politics at Whitman College in Eastern Washington and author of this extraordinarily powerful work of narrative nonfiction he'll be talking about today, The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez. Sandra Cisneros, in her review of the book, wrote, "This is an excellently researched and exquisitely told, here's a story of the Americas for our time." And I think that's certainly borne out in the text and the wonderful praise that Aaron's received for this book. I'm really excited to see how this can foster a discussion about engaged scholarship and scholar activism today. And Aaron will talk more about the book itself, but I just wanted to begin with a few words about the impact of Aaron's scholar activism on me personally as a student at Whitman many more years ago than I would care to admit. I had the good fortune of participating in the first trip to the US-Mexico border that Aaron organized for students. He had worked there as an activist before graduate school and witnessed the impacts of militarization, trade policy, and xenophobia on the border and on border communities. And so when Aaron first reached out about the possibility of coming for a series of talks in Madison, these flashes of memories of visiting maquiladoras and our homestay with families and this just overwhelming sense that these border stories need to be told far and wide went through my mind, and I'm so delighted to have him here today to share that with us. This book in many ways embodies that same blend of human relationships, critical theory, and storytelling. And I'm especially grateful to LASI's for the support for making this event possible, and also co-sponsorship from the Havens Right Center and the Politics, Culture, and Society Brown Bag. All of those groups have been very generous in making this possible. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming in the rain. Free food will do that, right? Is this good? And thank you, Laura. That was a very kind introduction. And that the sessions that you guys are going to have is pretty incredible. I kind of want to come back for those next two talks. They sound really great. So it's cool. It's really wonderful to be here in Madison. Yes, Madison? Okay. See, when I landed here, and it was sweltering, and then it was like typhooning, I thought I had mixed up my trip to Houston. But then I got in the Uber, and the Uber driver, he starts talking about socialism. and I said, well, do you mean like socialism, or like socialism, the epithet that gets thrown around today? And he starts talking about, well, Fabianism versus anarcho-syndicalism versus Irish Republican socialism. I was, okay, yeah, Madison, got it. Not Houston, I'm here. And that ride actually got weirder and weirder. But I won't go into the rest of it. Yeah. Madison. Thank you, Laura, so much for making this possible, and Sarah and Alberto, who is out of town today, and all of Lassis for making this possible. And also, I just had an incredible visit yesterday with sociology graduate students. Really great conversation, and really got to see some really impressive work yesterday, spending time with the Madison Area Latinos Professionals Association, which is a really cool organization. So it's been great, aside from the Houston weather. Before I get started, I want to just talk briefly about the book's form, which is the most noticeably curious thing about this book, at least within academic circles. Although I think at Wisconsin here, folks are maybe more accustomed to this form of academic writing. But it's narrative nonfiction. And when the book actually first came out, a bunch of media sites, NPR, Mother Jones, some others, had to publish corrections because they called it a novel. And I was pissed. Because, I had worked really hard to verify and cross-check as much of this book as I could. I'm definitely steeped in post-structuralism enough to know that the word fact is fraught. But, come on, I paid $9,000 out of my own pocket to a fact checker. It's nonfiction. But with a little bit of help from some good friends who told me to take a deep breath, I started to realize that that genre confusion was a high compliment and central to what I was doing, in fact. In a 2011 interview about his book, Slow Violence, your former Wisconsin colleague, Rob Nixon, said, quote, "I think it's often easier to theorize in the official codes of theory rather than to theorize lightly through scene, object, story, and incident in ways that keep alive the sensual serendipities of language." I thought a lot about that quote as I was writing this book. I was inspired by it. I would just add one thing to that. For me, the challenge was not just the part about keeping alive the sensual serendipities of language, which I think is maybe a really shapely, nice way of saying write well, y'all. Write good prose. But the thing that and that's the idea he grappled with a lot in the interview, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a good admonition, especially given the kind of the fun recreational sport that making fun of bad academic writing is. Right? It makes sense to say that. But the thing I really grappled with in writing this book was the other piece of that quote, the less commented on piece about theorizing lightly through character, scene, and incident, what I would call narrative. And I'm still not entirely sure what Nixon meant by that, but I think it's what I was trying to do in this book. And for me, that's different from writing accessibly for a wider audience, or deploying vivid anecdotes and evocative scenes to illustrate academic arguments. Because I think, and that's something many academics already do beautifully, really well. It's also not just about using narrative tools to translate scholarly research for a wider audience, although it is that also. At root, what I was interested in was combining, and I think this is what Nixon is talking about, is combining scholarly research with narrative tools learned from fiction writers as a way of knowing the world. as a form of knowledge production that's uniquely positioned to capture and explore human experience in relation to power and history. To sink into and then really bring alive for readers the experiences of violence and displacement and agency. And like any form of knowledge production, like any method, it's fraught and has limits. And I'll talk a little bit about that and would welcome more discussion later. But I think it's worth exploring. And this long preamble, really this preamble is both a pitch to you all as scholars and students to embrace elements of narrative as a way to broaden your audience, yes, sure, but also as a way to craft more nuanced understandings of the world. This preamble is also kind of a roundabout way of saying that the book I'm about to talk about today reads like a novel, theorizes lightly, and is filled with twists and turns that I don't want to give away today, which makes it almost impossible to give a standard academic talk about it. This is, I think, the second academic talk I've done about the book, so I'll do my best. So the book itself centers primarily on one young immigrant woman, Aida Hernandez, who's growing up undocumented in Douglas, Arizona, in the 1990s and 2000s. Douglas, Arizona is a border community. And she's growing up there just as policies that are crafted far from the border, with very little grounding in the lived realities of migration or life in the borderlands, come crashing down on this small town. And the book follows Aida through her childhood, which is marked by domestic violence and tough, but also hopeful. It follows her through family separation, years before anyone was talking about that in the news, through deportation, horrible violence in Mexico, into for-profit immigration detention, the asylum process, and really into the everyday workings of a whole border security industrial complex that includes for-profit detention, but is actually way bigger and broader than that, as I will talk about shortly. And Aida is growing up undocumented, while Douglas, thanks to those policies, is quickly becoming one of the most heavily policed small towns in the United States. She's also growing up poor because Douglas is a Mexican-American border town that is still reeling from years of disinvestment that began during Reagan-era plant closures and anti-union campaigns that laid waste to what was a vibrant, upwardly mobile Mexican-American unionized working class in the community. And I think it's important to stress that American history underpinning this border story because I think when most folks in the United States think about working class decline, they think about white communities, in the Rust Belt. And because of that, an outsider passing through Douglas today might see the Mexican-American community, the derelict buildings, and just assume this place is naturally poor, just inevitably going to be like this. And they would be so very wrong. This is a historical process that has been imposed on Douglas over years. In fact, tiny Douglas lay at the very literal center of crucial moments in the rise of worker power in the United States in the post-war period. Organized Mexican-American workers in the Douglas copper smelter and in other Arizona copper towns won the Phelps-Dodge rule, which was a key Supreme Court ruling in the 1940s that really cemented the right of workers to organize and opened the door for the whole post-war period of prosperity and declining inequality in Douglas and beyond. And then, in 1983, when Phelps-Dodge fired striking workers, it was one of the very first salvos in that long organized assault on organized labor and worker power that we've seen over the past 30 years. So Douglas, is not this kind of remote rural town in the far corner of southeast Arizona. It's actually a central place to try to understand U.S. capitalism and working class decline. And we know that while white working class decline elicits calls for empathy and hand-wringing and calls for solutions, black and brown working class decline usually elicits calls for tougher policing. Which is very much the story of Douglass. So much of this is a book about immigration and the border, but it's also about that larger relationship between deindustrialization of communities of color and militarized policing. And in that sense, Douglass the town, reviewers have said that Douglass the town is also a character in this book, and I think they're right. And I don't think you can understand the way folks in Douglass have responded to the steady militarization of their community without understanding that long history of racialized disinvestment and deindustrialization. So for Ida, growing up poor and undocumented in this milieu, it caused Ida's first death. What sociologists might call social death. Because Ida is fully part of her community, where she's lived since she's 8. Right? She's an active maker of that community. She's a member of that community, yet she's excluded from real membership in it through all kinds of legal and extra-legal means. She's a citizen without citizenship. And she is denied rights and cut off opportunities that should have been hers. And she's going to pay a heavy and violent cost for mistakes that others would not face consequences for. Ida has to fight for her life, literally, many times throughout this book. She's essentially sentenced to death for making the kinds of tiny mistakes that anyone growing up in any community makes. But the larger journey in this book, I think the real suspense and uncertainty at the heart of this book is about a young woman risking everything to see if she can get from a place, that place of social death, to a place where she isn't just surviving the world the rest of us have made on the US-Mexico border, but she's actually thriving, fully alive. There's lots of twists and spoilers and turns in the book, and I'm not going to tell you much more about the story tonight or today. I just want to talk a little bit about how the book came about and maybe gesture towards some of the conclusions that emerge out of it. So I first went to the US-Mexico border in the fall of 1993. I had been active in the Central American sanctuary movement in other parts of the country and went to the border to work in the sanctuary movement just as it was winding down. And I stayed and became active, particularly with economic and environmental justice issues on the border. And I worked there for 4 years, which is a really relatively short time in the grand scheme of things, but an incredibly impactful, formative time personally, intellectually, politically. I met my wife there. We were part of this incredible cross-border, binational activist community. Later, our daughter was born unexpectedly on a trip to the border. And it just seemed appropriate because some of you will know this. There is a beauty and a richness and a creativity to life in the borderlands that just gets left out of the news today when people are talking about border crises today. And so I kept returning. When I began teaching at Whitman, as Laura was saying, I started bringing students back to the border regularly and seeing how the border shifted over many years. And the border kept calling me even as I wrote books about other topics, even as I got involved in immigrant rights activism at the state and local level in Washington. I was continually called back to the border because I was reminded that challenges that are faced by all of us in communities all over the United States can just be seen in stark relief on the US-Mexico border. And as a result of that, folks in the borderlands have a lot to teach the rest of us in the rest of the country about how we live our lives across increasingly hardened divides. And there's one more bit of history and context that I want to fill in that kind of underpins the book. And that is that the fall of 1993 was not just a formative time for me when I went to the border for the first time. It was a formative time for the border. Does anyone here remember the fall of 1993 on the border? This would bring out the border scholars in the room. In the fall of 1993, 26 years ago actually, 26 years ago last week, unbeknownst to all of us back then, a new approach to border security was being tested out in El Paso. And it would end up becoming the single-minded center of our entire focus, our entire approach to immigration and the border since. And everything we're grappling with around the border today, in many ways, arises from that new approach to border and immigration. And by a fluke, I happened to be in El Paso, working in El Paso that week. People were befuddled. No one had any idea what this would mean. It seemed different. Everyone was trying to figure out what's going on. And basically what had happened was the Border Patrol sector chief, Reyes, who rode the success of this experiment to a seat in Congress, a Democratic seat in Congress for Texas, what he did was he took his Border Patrol agents off of their mobile patrols and simply lined them up one after another along the most heavily crossed part of the urban El Paso border. And his idea was that if you completely shut down the relatively easy part of the border to cross, it will force people out into the mountains and deserts, the more difficult terrain outside of town. And then he was kind of reasoning like a microeconomist. No offense to economists. But he was thinking that this will make border crossing more difficult and more dangerous. That will make border crossing more expensive, and fewer people will do it. Well, he was absolutely right that it made, we know now, 26 years later, it made border crossing more dangerous and more expensive, but it has not caused fewer people to cross the border. This strategy was called prevention through deterrence. And this was the government deliberately weaponizing the desert in the service of deadly deterrence. And over the next 26 years, we would see the government deploy many new weapons of deterrence. Border Patrol agents slashing water bottles in the desert that have been left by humanitarian groups. Kids kept in cages, people being denied vaccines in immigration detention, the assault on legal asylum processes and other legal immigration the assault on asylum processes and other legal forms of immigration, the heaping of criminal punishments on top of civil administrative matters. When you see those things today, know that they're not aberrations or the work of bad apples, or just artifacts of Trump. They are the results of a 26-year bipartisan strategy designed to make border crossing more dangerous and cruel, supposedly to deter migrants. And one of the themes that runs through this book is that prevention through deterrence hasn't just weaponized the desert. It has weaponized violence against women, just as it has weaponized the desert. And this is not to say that women in border communities experience more gender violence than in other communities. That's not at all clear, no matter how much Trump talks about rapists and murderers. And certainly not all violence against women in the borderlands arises from immigration policies. But rather what I'm saying is that our current approach to border security knowingly cultivates and benefits from heightened vulnerability to gender violence on the border. And this produced vulnerability can take just almost banal everyday forms. Several times in the book, different abusive men tell women variations on the same theme. Go ahead, call the police. If you call the police, I'll get a night in jail, I'll get a slap in the wrist, but you'll get deported. You'll lose your kid. it can also be quite blunt. Okay, this is the moment of truth here. How many of you have seen or will admit to have seeing the Sicario movies? Sicarios, Narcos on Netflix. Yeah, okay, a few of you have seen these. Yeah, the honest people are talking. You know, to watch that genre of TV, you would think that cartels, violent cartels preying and exploiting women were the enemies of the US government. In fact, by the strict logic of prevention through deterrence, a strategy founded on the idea that we will make border crossing as dangerous as possible, cartels are our allies. They're force multipliers for that strategy. And the anthropologist Jason De Leon has uncovered documents, early government documents that say things like, an early sign of success of this strategy will be increasing deaths on the southwest border. Right, so this is very much a strategy. So with cartels, you can say that we have outsourced some of the worst violence of our 26-year bipartisan effort to make crossing the border dangerous to those cartels. And then we act all outraged at the kind of the savagery of cartels, as if they were different. So in sum, for this part, the border isn't broken. It's actually working pretty much as intended. And that is the problem. So back in the 1990s, the strategy spread quickly. It clicked instantly with President Clinton's desire to take a page from the Republicans' tough on crime, dog whistle playbook. And it turned out that ever more spectacular, ever more expensive forms of deterrence had bipartisan political appeal. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, I calculated that we have spent the inflation-adjusted equivalent of 2 Marshall Plans for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, pursuing prevention through deterrence-focused immigration and border enforcement since it rolled out in the 1990s. Of course, none of this achieved its stated goal. As we now know, as we can see, as Central American asylum seekers continue to come to the border, even as we exceed ourselves in meting out cruelties and exceed ourselves in making the border dangerous. Deterrence does a lot of things politically, economically in our country. It's productive to many people and many institutions. It's incredibly good at producing vulnerable, highly exploited workers who have been stripped of money and options by the expensive, dangerous border crossing, as the anthropologist Gilberto Rosas shows so well. But it does not deter. Instead, by the late 1990s, it began to funnel from Texas, from California, a continent's worth of migration straight into Arizona and the border's most dangerous deserts. And one of the very first places that strategy hit was the small border communities of Douglas and Agua Prieta, where much of this story is set, and where Aida was growing up as that happened. And there were a lot of tough interviews and tough moments in this process of doing this research, but one of the most moving and tough parts was talking with people in Douglas and Agua Prieta about their memories of their slow realization, often through layers of denial of what was happening to their community, how their community was being turned on its head by these policies. A lot of people remembered or told a story about a town hall meeting with federal officials who were explaining this strategy in the late 1990s. And folks remember this usually taciturn, quiet rancher standing up and saying, "You mean you bleeping planned this?" And they had. And over the next 20 years, Douglas and Agua Prieta were at the center of the storm of immigration politics. Militias, politicians, the global media all descended on Douglas and Agua Prieta, brave movements of residents, particularly from faith communities, rose up to try to heal the wedges being driven between the two halves of their one community. And people chafed against the militarization of their lives and the imposition of hardened divides in their community, but they had also come to depend on it as an economic lifeblood. By 2014, 1 in 7 employed adult men in Douglas worked for law enforcement. And many